Many of the fish recovered from Charleston are common estuarine species representing fishing practices and technologies which people living on this coast relied on for millennia. Some of these practices are familiar to us in the present century. The longevity and importance of this fishery is evident in the percentages of fish taxa contained in archaeological assemblages from sites bracketed by Charleston, South Carolina, and St. Augustine, Florida. Percentages of fish taxa average half of the vertebrate taxa before 1565 and a third of those taxa thereafter. A core group of estuarine fish dominates the fishery, consisting of sea catfishes, mullets, and drums, particularly sea trouts and Atlantic croakers. After 1565, this same core group dominates the fishery with the addition of sheepsheads and flounders. The habits and habitats of these fish make them vulnerable to shallow water technologies, particularly mass capture facilities, though many also can be taken with individual capture devices. This core fishery persisted for over 4,000 years. It is against this backdrop that we consider fishing practices and technologies in Charleston. European-sponsored colonization began near Charleston in 1565, when Spanish Florida was established, and expanded considerably after the Carolina colony was founded in 1670. In many respects, Native American traditions informed this fishery, especially in the early years, though the overall role of fishing in Charleston's economy was diminished by the addition of Eurasian livestock and by cultural choices made by Europeans and Africans in this multi-ethnic city. Although the percentage of fish taxa after 1565 are low compared to pre-1565 levels, the use of fish in Charleston is relatively high compared to that at the Spanish and other English settlements, also illustrated on this graph. Our database comes from 4 decades of excavation and 55 sites or site components in urban Charleston, where vertebrate faunal remains are particularly well preserved thanks to the prevalence of oyster shell as both food remains and the basis for lime mortar. All of the collections were excavated by the Charleston Museum and analyzed at the University of Georgia. Fishing was a significant and consistent part of life in Charleston. Fishes constitute 49% of the taxa and 25% of the individuals in the city's archaeological record. All but 4 of the 55 Charleston assemblages contain at least one fish taxon, regardless of ethnicity, status, or site function. When subdivided into 4 broad time periods, we find the practice and technology of fishing in Charleston was relatively constant until the 1850s. After 1850, a change occurs, which is not so much in the overall role of fishing in the city, which is what this table shows, but in the types of fishes used. 45 of the fish taxa and 413 of the fish individuals in the Charleston fishery are local estuarine fishes. This local fishery is dominated by a core group of fish, which constitute at least 85% of the fish individuals. This core fishery consists largely of drums, primarily sea trouts, Atlantic croakers, black drums, and red drums, hardhead and topsail catfishes, and black sea basses. Mullets, flounders, and sheepsheads form a second tier of core fish. With the exception of sea basses, which we will address shortly, these are easily captured estuarine fish with a long history of use. They generally are present inshore throughout the year, though with seasonal fluctuations in abundance, size, and location. This core group probably was available through formal and informal outlets, as well as self-caught by individual householders or their staff. They are particularly susceptible to mass capture methods such as weirs, nets, and other impoundments, though it's likely hand lines and set lines were used as well. Although non-local fish are extremely rare in the Charleston fishery, the percentages do increase over the decades. It seems likely these non-local fish were taken in deeper waters, 15 to 30 kilometers offshore. In the early years, this probably was by fishermen on large northern-owned vessels who sold part of their catch in the city during their winter fishing season. Parrotfish and triggerfish probably are curios brought to the city through Charleston's overseas shipping interests, joining other exotic animals in the city. Seabasses, locally known as blackfishes, were important members of the Charleston fishery, a role that also increased over time. This may be a uniquely Charleston phenomenon. Blackfishes are reported from only one assemblage prior to 1565 and 3 assemblages other than Charleston after 1565. In these other assemblages, they contribute no more than 1% of the fish individuals. The other historic venues are Santa Elena and St. Augustine. Blackfishes are slightly more abundant in the Santa Elena assemblage than they are in the St. Augustine ones. Although small blackfish occur inshore, the most productive fishing locations and the largest fish are found in more dangerous offshore waters where fishing requires more time, seaworthy craft, and sturdy gear. Blackfish expand Charleston's fishing practices to offshore waters. Despite the obvious role played by fish in Charleston, visitors thought fish were rare in the city. In 1808, traveler J. Lambert observed, though the rivers abound with a great variety of fish, yet very few are brought to market. The Duke of Saxe-Weimar observed in 1824, fish were not presented in so great a variety as I expected. These visitors instead marveled at the range of vegetables and particularly fruits available in the center market. Shields reports the variety of fish in the market was limited. Only 6 saltwater fish are featured regularly in market records: bass, sheep's head, drum, mackerel, and blackfish. Only bass and drum are said to be common. These fish also were mentioned by Harriet Pinckney Horay in her 1770 cookbook and by Sarah Rutledge in her 1847 cookbook. This apparently limited range persisted into the mid-1800s. One explanation for the limited quantity and variety of fish in markets compared to the archaeological record could be the role of northern fishermen in the city's commercial fishery. Before the 1860s, commercial fishing was controlled by fishermen who sent most of their catch north to their home ports for sale. Another explanation for the disparity between these accounts and the archaeological record is that, like other foods consumed in Charleston, not all of the fish was purchased from official markets. Much of the local fishery can be traced to the contributions of African men and women, a tradition rooted in the personal time afforded by the task system. The roles of boatmen and fishermen were monopolized by enslaved men until the early 1800s, when owners limited their participation in these occupations and free black men came to dominate the profession. They are particularly associated with a fleet of small boats known as the Mosquito fleet, which traces its roots to the late 1700s. The Mosquito fleet initially consisted of dugout canoes, 5 to 9 meters in length, but eventually included sailing craft holding 2 to 7 people. In the early 1800s, nearly 100 men engaged in this fishery, and by 1880, the fleet consisted of as many as 50 small vessels. Catches averaged 16 to 45 kilos per man day, and as much as 300 kilos was landed frequently by one boat in a day's outing. Others claimed catches of over 450 kilos, and one claimed an all-time record of 2,260 kilos in one overnight trip. Catches of this size generally occurred between 1865 and 1940. Increasingly, the fleet targeted the inner Blackfish banks, some 8 to 12 kilometers offshore, though most boats returned to port each afternoon to sell the day's catch. Much of the catch consisted of blackfish, though it also included non-local fish and adult estuarine fishes spawning in offshore waters. Shields notes that freedmen were drawn to extractive opportunities that gave them freedom from supervision, while continuing enterprises familiar from the time of enslavement. Land for hunting was owned by someone else, but the waters were open and long the domain of black laborers. Many fishermen did not want to work for white-owned businesses and preferred to sell their catch directly to rural plantations from wharves outside the city and through hucksters and street vendors. Hart cites a 1765 advertisement in the South Carolina Gazette notifying Charlestonians that fish were available at the upper end of Captain Roper's wharf near the curtain line when a white flag was hoisted. Many street vendors were women, often the fishermen's wives. These outlets forestalled fish reaching the city's markets and may explain why visitors thought fresh fish were rare. Much of the Mosquito fleet's success after the Civil War is attributed to Black entrepreneur Charles Leslie, who organized local fishermen to supply his prosperous fish market. Born free in 1841, Leslie was a skilled harbor pilot with a first-hand knowledge of local waters. He set up a partnership with Cuban boat captain A.F. Lopez near the end of the Civil War, rebuilt the local fleet, and applied his skills and persuasion to improving the market for fish. Leslie sold to the formal market and was responsible for improving a market building on East Bay Street. After Lopez's death in 1870, Leslie became the principal supplier of fish through the market, and after 1889, a supplier to the scientific community. He created the first soft-shell crab nursery in the United States and made harvesting shrimp for a local market more efficient. The 19th century market included a separate fish market and a large pond at the foot of Market Street. The stone enclosure held fish brought live to market by the Mosquito fleet. Leslie monopolized this fish market by offering superior quality fresh fish, which he kept alive in pens on Union Wharf. A few 19th century households had private fish ponds. Most pertinent to our study, Leslie sold what was considered trash fish or less desirable catch, porgies, scups, and adult drums, at a low price to appeal to poorer folk, black and white. But he attracted a wealthier clientele with pompano, jack, red snapper, bastard snapper, grunt, brim, squirrelfish, and hake, in addition to blackfish. Markets were but one source of fish for many households. Official records do not include fish purchased directly from fishermen and street vendors, or those obtained through personal fishing by people of all stations, either for recreation or for sustenance. It is possible, of course, that only fillets of non-local fish were purchased by householders from formal markets, leaving little archaeological evidence for their use at residential sites, though this seems unlikely if consumers preferred purchasing live fish. Likewise, much of the non-local fish used in the city may not be recovered or identified. None of these alternatives explain the abundance of local fish in the archaeological record, especially sea catfishes, a fish not mentioned in contemporary accounts. The archaeological record highlights this household level use of fish from these and other undocumented sources, including recreational or personal fishing. The trajectory of Charleston fishery follows a trend that became pronounced in the 20th century. Fishery data usually are reported as biomass or weight and can be linked to mean trophic level, a marker of ecosystem health. Mean trophic levels above 3.4 are considered commercially unsustainable. The red diamonds in this graph are the four Charleston time periods. The rise between 1750 and 1850, numbers 15 and 17, is followed by a sharp decline. After 1978, the mean trophic level of the entire coastal fishery rose again, followed by another pronounced decline that by the 1980s raised alarm on a global scale. This is precisely the phenomenon noted by Polly and his colleagues and termed fishing down the food chain, attributed to overfishing. Leslie himself noted the depletion of blackfish in the 1880s, but the 20th century decline involved the entire fishery. This study highlights the role of personal fishing in informal fish sales, documenting the importance of African men and women selling fish in the streets and from the docks. Before the 1860s, many of the vendors and fishermen were enslaved. This opportunity expanded after Emancipation, with many continuing their fishing tradition by joining the Mosquito fleet. Much of their catch was unreported because they preferred selling outside of formal markets. For over 2 centuries, the city's residents relied on a local estuarine fishery that apparently eluded the notice of tourists and commercial fishermen alike. The informal, unofficial fishery taking place beyond official purview is underrepresented in the documentary record. Memoirs and official records suggest fish rarely were used in the city until after about 1850, but the archaeological record suggests otherwise. Some of the fish sold in the market are absent or minor members of the archaeological record, and some of the fish abundant in that record are not mentioned in written accounts. The archaeological record summarized here suggests fishing practices target local estuaries, just as they had for millennia. Although interpreting animals in urban settings benefits from written records, those records may be biased by limited opportunities for travelers and others to observe or even recognize the entire distribution system. Such observers also may have focused on the unusual, feeling no need to mention the common fare. To explore the full range of Charleston's fishing practices and technologies, and to advance 21st century studies of the world's fishery collapse, we should consider both archival and archaeological sources of information. Clearly, archaeology is an important data source for the history of fishing in South Carolina.